Welcome, everyone, to another edition of the Shaltazar Podcast. This is episode number 18, and my guest today is Jonathan Morgan. Jonathan has been a friend, acquaintance of mine for a number of years. I first met him when I sampled his amazing massage therapy gift. He is truly a master at that, and we've become friends, acquaintances over the years. Thank you, Jonathan, for being with us on today's podcast.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Jeffrey, for having me. I'm honored to be part of the process.
Right, and if you would, and indeed it is a process. Indeed it is a process, and listeners, you've heard me say this before. Life is truly a journey, and in my journey, I've been very fortunate to meet some really interesting people. I got an opportunity to meet Jonathan. And really, our spiritual journey is sometimes just about the people that we meet. And Jonathan was one of those people that I had an immediate connection to, and we chatted when I would have massages. We would chat in between. And, sometimes we think of our spiritual journey as something deeper and very esoteric and very mystical. But I'm really a big fan of believing that our spiritual journey is just our journey through life and how we choose to show up in that journey. So, Jonathan, why don't you tell the listeners a bit about yourself? I could read your bio. It's a great bio. It will be there in the description of the podcast. But why don't you tell the guests a little bit about who you are and what you do in life and a little bit about maybe your spiritual beliefs.
Sure, yeah. So I guess just from what you were saying just now, I think what kind of resonated for me upon meeting you initially was learning about how you were, a spiritual life coach and a medium, and in some respect that kind of circled back to maybe initial ways that I was, dipping my toes in the spiritual waters in a kind of intentional way. And that came out of the grieving process. I lost my father to cancer when I was 23. And it was around that time that I had my first visit with a psychic medium. And so out of that, I kind of got into some intuitive development work. So I thought when I met you that there was an interesting kind of, I always look at these when cycles kind of reoccur. And I just kind of, I noticed that when I met you. But yeah, in terms of my own, a brief bio, I am a massage therapist, and I have been practicing, for about 11 years. And I teach part-time at a college in the Toronto area in that program, generally in kind of anatomical realms or pathophysiological. But I also work with students who are in treatment with the public, either through a clinic or various kind of co-ops in the community. And then I also just over the last 5 years have been working and since finished my undergrad degree at U of T, University of Toronto. And that was a bit of a departure from massage in that I kind of went into a humanities bent and I did a double major in sociology and Indigenous studies, and then a minor in Buddhist psychology. So with that, I'm in the process right now of applying for a master's. Ideally, I would start next year and kind of move into counseling or psychotherapeutic realm. And I guess down the road, maybe by the time I'm 40, I would, have within my skill set a holistic kind of framework from which to kind of approach health or healing.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that was motivated by my own desire to kind of, work through my own issues.
Right, and that raises a great point, because often we are on this journey because of our life circumstances. Could be our personal history, could be events and experiences that happen in our life. And it's so interesting as I have my coach's hat on and I'm listening to you talk about your father passing and connecting, to a medium and meeting me, and then moving from your dedication to physical wellness into more of the mental emotional, taking that sociology and psychology, and then your leanings towards Aboriginal, because of course there's no greater connection to that higher power than through the Aboriginal energy. Often those people were phenomenal healers because they didn't have the interruptions of a more complex society like we have now. And so from my perspective, I certainly see your progression as something that maybe could be orchestrated by some higher power that's leading you towards where you're going. Does that make any sense to you?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess I don't know exactly what that direction is. I mean, it's just something that's kind of unfolded as I've been going. So yeah, but I would also like to kind of imagine or envisage that I'm kind of co-creating in that process, or collaborating with higher powers, or a higher power. Um,
Well, for sure, because I don't believe that plan that this higher power has for us can be executed, can come to fulfillment without our co-creation. And
right.
but the point that I want to make is that you seem to be a willing participant in following that guidance, even if sometimes that guidance doesn't feel as strong. And I think that's important for our listeners to understand and to realize, is sometimes, our guidance is just a nudge, and we just have a sense of doing what we do, wanting to take your master's, wanting to get into counseling. Certainly there could be some logic to moving out of physical wellness. The life of a massage therapist is a challenging one, because you're certainly using a lot of your energy and strength to heal someone else. But if you sort of look at that in a more mystical way, that nudging could be present in your life, and you are a willing co-creator by following those nudges.
Yeah, and I mean, I guess I certainly try to keep my ears open, essentially, and I appreciate when I can make sense or see a pattern, or see those kind of synchronicities. That seems to me like I'm getting I don't know, like a reassurance or reaffirmation.
Yeah. That's a great point. Let's talk about those synchronicities, because often I find when I talk to people, they're saying, "Oh, well, I'm not getting any guidance, and I'm not connecting with that higher power," and they continue to tell me about their life and some of the things that happen. And all of a sudden you're hearing them talk about all of these coincidences in their life, and I'm saying, well, don't you think that might be some of that guidance? And they say, oh, no, the guidance, I would imagine, is coming through in a more direct fashion. And I sort
Right.
of put a smile on my face and say, no, I don't know if that's the case. There's a lot of people that believe. The book, The Celestine Prophecy, talks a lot about those synchronicities,
Right.
and how those synchronicities are really the universe talking to us. Do you believe in that?
Yeah, and I mean, I can relate to also feeling kind of directionless, and I think I didn't grow up in a religious construct. I mean, historically within my family, we are settlers to Turtle Island, but I mean, so obviously there's a kind of a waspy Protestant background, but my parents never took my brother or I to church, and I think that was intentional because they wanted us to kind of make our own decisions and come to our own understanding, in that sense of if we wanted to or not. And so I mean, I'm grateful for that. But also I think I had a sense of lacking in my adolescent years, not from a Christian context, but just from a spirituality. So it was a process, I guess, of my own uncovering. And I think that was stimulated by the loss of my father. And I mean, I also had a somewhat complicated relationship with my father, and I wasn't that close with him. So trying to make sense of, our history and my feelings towards him and our dynamic at the time of his death was obviously kind of part of that process, but also I think out of that I just decided, what, there are things that have always resonated with me, and I'm going to make a decision to believe, essentially, you know
Hmm.
um, and there was, I guess, taking that kind of leap of faith, like there was something kind of beautiful about that, and I could have decided to kind of stick to a more rational framework of seeing the world, and I decided at that point not to. And certainly, like at 23 years old, what I mean, my spirituality, I guess, has evolved from my 23-year-old self, which was what, like now, 14 years ago.
Right. Yes. As all of our beliefs certainly unfold, and it's interesting because some people are raised devoutly in a religion, and then find a different belief system for their own. In your case, your parents, your mother allowed you the freedom to find your own. Let's talk for a few minutes. You raised something that's really interesting, and that is because we throw that word around so much, spirituality.
Mm-hmm.
It's getting right up there these days with the word love.
Mm-hmm.
We talk so much about love, and I'm certainly a firm believer that we don't really understand the breadth and depth of that word.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's the same with spirituality. So let's chat for a few minutes, and maybe help our listeners who I'm sure are often puzzled about that word spirituality. I know for me, I hear that word and all of a sudden I conjure up who I think that person is, because they say, I'm spiritual. And it's like, I have found time and time and time again that who they are and what spirituality means to them is not what it does to me. So, Jonathan, share with the listeners a little bit about that spirituality, because you're very fortunate that you got an opportunity to not be indoctrinated with a certain belief system. You got to sort of figure it out on your own. And I'm sure you would admit that you are continuing to figure it out on your own, just like I am and everyone else is.
Of course, yeah. I mean, in fact, I think the earliest rumblings of spirituality were through, of all people, my father, who, a man of his generation, born in the late 40s, was not, in respect to my dad, was not very, at least he did not express emotional intelligence. So it might seem odd that, I was kind of imparted that wisdom through him, but I would say one of the biggest lessons that I can take right now is from our relationship would be like a real strong importance and deep reverence for connecting to the land. And so we spent a lot of time growing up canoeing, or fishing, or camping, and that was just it. We didn't necessarily do these grand trips out of country or province. We went up north, and it wasn't even necessarily in those years that we would sit down in a formalized way and say, there's spirit in the rocks and the trees or whatever. It was more just how to live off the land ethically, I guess. And I guess, even in those times, there was a lot of tough times, I think, as a kid going through those experiences, because there was some sense of, you need to toughen up, be a man, kind of rough it in the wilderness, and so there was always that dynamic. But I always had my connection to the land throughout those processes. I feel like, and I have memories of spirit communicating to me through exalted feelings, or feeling love on a warm breeze, or joy through sun's rays, or seeing the sun reflected on the sand underneath undulating waves or something. These were points or of solace, perhaps in times that were somewhat problematic, even when in my interpersonal dynamic with my dad at those times. I mean, it wasn't all a difficult relationship. But I think now that is something that I must do. Like I have to go canoeing or camping at least twice a year. And I'm outside as much as I can be.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess that's an entry point for me into spirituality.
Well, I'm gonna suggest more, Jonathan. I'm gonna suggest that that is the essence of your spirituality. I mean, as you're listening again, Mother Earth, Gaia, is the ultimate of the creation from the source, without the complications of human beings. And so, I think that your connection to the Earth is either a large part or the foundation of your spirituality. And just as you're talking, about the land teaching you to toughen up, I'm seeing this very loving teacher called Mother Earth, called nature, showing Jonathan Morgan about life. And so I'm going to suggest that maybe you are belittling that. I'm going to ask the listeners to just open their minds a little bit and open their hearts and realize that the deepest spiritual connections can come from something like being attached to the earth. Often we think it must be to some invisible deity, but the earth is again I repeat, the ultimate of God's creation. I'm fascinated at flowers and trees and how they form and how they live and how they die. And so, in a microcosm, I think that Mother Nature, the land, the earth, is a great spiritual teacher, as the Aboriginals realized. And I believe that your connection to the land also draws you to that, those Aboriginal teachings. There's no coincidence, again, that, in your university training, you are drawn towards learning about the Aboriginal ways. And so I think that your spirituality is deeply rooted in Mother Nature, in Gaia, in the Aboriginals. And I would encourage you to keep looking there and be proud that that is your spiritual teacher, because I think it's a great teacher.
Well, yeah, and I would, I guess from that perspective also, I in some respect, I think, it's just kind of our duty as settlers to recognize the history and of colonization, and because I grew up in a town that was essentially shared the lake with a reservation, I think those inequalities were contrasted. It was palpable and noticeable from a young age. So I think I've always been aware, and I've also had a mother who's a counselor and very compassionate, and so had always kind of drawn us to pay attention to kind of social inequality. So that is also part of it, I think. And so from my perspective, it's important to learn about the history of nation building on this continent, of Canada, I mean, because Canada in and of itself is a baby country within the context of nations that have been here for time immemorial. And so I think in order for me to do some of my own healing and to try to heal those relationships on a nation-to-nation basis, I think that it's important for me to do that work in terms of understanding the history and to honoring the treaties, as a means to also heal my ancestors, and whether or not they were kind of willing participants or knew of the history of cultural genocide here. It's incumbent upon me, as I do that healing for myself. I think it also heals my own lineage.
Right, and heals the world. It's interesting, again, as you're chatting. We're recording this podcast a couple of days after a federal election here in Canada that saw a liberal majority government returned as a minority, and we see the divisiveness of our country, Canada, where we see the resurgence of Quebec separatism and the difference that one of the provinces, Alberta, has with regard to oil and the whole issue of climate change. So once again, I'm going to suggest that your spirituality might be a lot deeper than some other people, and I really want to thank you for showing our guests that spirituality can often show up in a way that may not seem like it's spiritual. I think we're having an extremely deep spiritual conversation here, and we haven't really used a lot of the buzzwords that some of the people that consider themselves spiritual would use. That relationship that we have to the land is very indicative of the relationship that maybe we're building with each other. And you talked about showing reverence to the land and understanding the land, and yet as human beings we have lost a lot of that, which is again evident by this election result that is showing divisiveness. And I'm sure you would know and you would agree from all those years of spending with the land, if you try to fight the land, it's not going to make your stay very easy, is it?
No, and I also think this is my own belief that humans may suffer from their actions, but I think the planet will be okay in the long term. The planet will be here. I don't have a dire prognostication here, but I think ultimately it is the greatest teacher. And through that, the Haudenosaunee have the words that come before all else, or the Thanksgiving address, and that's all about how we as humans are a smaller part of a bigger collection of communities, right? And communities being plants and rocks and stars, and all of our lessons are there, And you mentioned we can see death and birth and creation all around us all the time. And this concept, I always used to have this idea that being trapped in Toronto, I was disconnected from nature, and we are still surrounded by it, even if it's in a park or just looking outside my window right now. I can see the leaves turning and falling, and so that's helpful for me too, because it's not always easy to get out of the city.
Right, and so every time you talk, you raise some. I get so excited because you raise some very interesting points. This weekend, I was out in nature at the Rouge Urban National Park, and that connection and those leaves and that water and Lake Ontario was just so cleansing, so spiritually cleansing for me. But I want to go back to something else you talked about what I couldn't help but hearing you say was talking about a unity. And when we are in unity with our land, with our surroundings, with Mother Earth, then we are much different than when we are in the duality. And so one of Shaltazar's great teachings is around the unity and the duality of the human being. And so if we keep nature separate from us, if we keep other people separate from us, if we allow racism to cloud our beingness, if we allow judgment to do that, if we do it to the land, it's the same as doing it to other people. And so I really truly believe that the land offers us a great opportunity to practice unity, to being at one. And so I would challenge some of our listeners, when you go out in nature, do you feel separate from that nature, or do you feel connected in unity with it? And I would suggest, Jonathan, when you are out in nature, you feel a greater sense of unity because you've been practicing for a lot of years.
Certainly, I don't feel lonely when I'm alone in nature.
Right. Well, just think about that. Think about that. Is that not an amazing spiritual principle? Is that not what spirituality is all about? Is that no matter where we are, we don't feel alone. Yeah. And so here it is, you are practicing, your meditation is to be out in nature and to convene with that nature, to connect with that nature in a way that allows you to be at one. And if all us city dwellers would be able to do the same thing, And as you pointed out, even if you live in a dense, urban area, there is an opportunity to get out there, to hug the tree, to watch that leaf fall, and to imagine the cycle of birth and death. There's so many lessons that we can get, and so I think I'm really enjoying, by the way, our conversation, because you are bringing up something that I probably wouldn't have brought up or talked about on my own, and that is the spirituality of being connected with nature, with the earth, with our roots, with our ancestors, all of those. The learning that you have from the Aboriginals connects us in a deep way to our heritage, to our roots, to past generations. And that's all about unity. And I will tell you, in what I believe is becoming an increasingly divisive world, we need more unity. We need more connection. So I'm going to suggest to you, Jonathan, that you are a deeply spiritual individual. And I know before we started to record the podcast, you and I were chatting, and you were kind of wondering about this spirituality, and you have been able to exhibit to me a deep spiritual connection without really being able to maybe label it spirituality.
Right. Well, I mean, that's cool. What you were just saying, I was thinking of Joni Mitchell's line, we are stardust, right? Like, essentially every element on the planet or everything is made of the same constituent parts, so there is that unity or that connection right there.
Right.
And it's just expressed in different forms. And I think there's wisdom in the different forms, how they, whether it's the rocks or the trees or the flowers or the bees, they all have their own kind of knowledges to share with us if we listen.
Right. Right.
I have one of my professors who is also a famous writer. She's First Nations from the Stalo Nation in the West Coast, Lee Miracle. She said something to the likes of, the importance of she kind of stressed the importance of being conscious of who we are, and that, like, we owe this self-awareness to the land. And so I think, like, to kind of riff off that, to kind of feed our highest selves or kind of follow our spiritual development means like a commitment to sustain self-awareness. But in that, I guess, like, for me, that comes through meditation or that comes through ritual. And, when I was a teenager, I had two really close girlfriends I'm still quite close with. And it was kind of through them that I think, we started with tarot cards and got into kind of pagan ritual. And what I learned from all of that was it's a nature-based religion that, if you're doing ritual, it's really just a physical representation of what you are already kind of bringing in or want to kind of push out, essentially. But I guess, like, that has been a way for me to kind of, and it's ebbed and flowed and come in different intensities at times in my life, but that's kind of been a way for me to kind of pay attention to the cycles of nature, the moon, as a means for my own kind of self-awareness, and also as a means to kind of connect as well.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm a firm believer that awareness is consciousness, and as I have been on my spiritual journey for the last 17 years, I focus a lot on my awareness, and I can tell you that I am aware in a different way. I'm not saying that high awareness is good and low awareness is bad. The late David Hawkins, the author of Power versus Force and a lot of other great books, talked about something about the human worldview, and your worldview often determined your vibration or your level of consciousness. And so as we are able to look at things from that larger perspective, that larger awareness, we are able to see life in different ways. And once again, I'm going to bring it back to nature. I think for you, and certainly for me, and hopefully for a lot of other people, looking at nature is a great way to heighten your awareness, because there isn't the distraction and the complexities of human life. I certainly, when I'm downtown in Toronto in the hustle and bustle, I have difficulty getting a bigger picture, because there's comings and goings, and Toronto's a very multicultural society, and it's really kind of hard for me to see the bigger picture. Whereas when I'm in nature, like I was this past weekend, it all makes such great sense. And so again, I encourage people to use nature as a way of heightening your spirituality. I know some people believe they've got to do their yoga, or they got to go to meditation retreats. And I don't know if you have noticed, but a lot of meditation retreats are in nature. And so, nature and connecting to nature is a very, very deeply spiritual practice. And we can do it very easily, and I would highly encourage you to do so. A lot of people think that it's not, but you are certainly living proof that it has increased your sense of awareness. And I just want to finish this train of thought by saying that I'm a believer that awareness will lead to choice, and choice will lead to change. So just that greater sense of awareness allows you more choices. Mm-hmm. And when you choose those different choices, your life is going to change.
Yeah, and if I could just add to that, I think, sometimes when we are in the hustle and bustle of the deep in the urban center, it's so densely packed with people. But interestingly, in those kinds of environments, we all have oftentimes earphones on, maybe without even music on, as a means to kind of make space. And also we may be walking and looking at our phone. It's a rare, it's like the closer we are together, and probably I'm assuming, this is the kind of the most concentrated time in history. It's like we have these senses of alienation and disconnection on the rise. And yet when we have more space, we tend to feel more connected, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think sometimes, like you say, those earphones are to shut that out. It's so interesting that you can be out in nature and not feel alone, and others can be in the midst of millions of people and totally feel alone. So yeah. I can understand that. For me, I always like every once in a while to look up at the sky, and I find that that God's artwork of the clouds are always a great way for me to appreciate. And I watch the clouds, and in a city like Toronto, sometimes we have some very interesting winds, and I watch those clouds move across the sky, and that again helps me connect to something that is beyond my physicality. And so once again, nature, I think, is a great way to connect to the essence of life.
Yeah, and I also, like, I in July, in terms of like the animals, I got a puppy, and I grew up with dogs, but I haven't had one on my own ever, and I'm now 37, and the amount of people that I have met in my neighborhood, where I've lived for a couple of years now, just in the last 5 months or less, has been really quite surprising. So many people stop to talk to me. I'm making eye contact and smiling in ways that I never did before, and it's because I'm walking, but it's also because of her and her. She doesn't have any. She just doesn't have any filter. She's kind of genuinely interested in going up to everybody.
Right.
So it's kind of been wonderful, because I was thinking, I would walk down the street sometimes and just say hi, smile as I go, and to think of that orientation, I don't know, 6 months ago, I never would have been oriented that way.
Right, and I think pets, I think dogs, cats, I think animals in general are again very close to that nature, right? We find as human beings that there's often such a challenge and difficulty and complexity in communicating with each other, that we want something that's simpler. And there's nothing that's simpler than a loving dog who doesn't speak English and barks and plays. And you're absolutely right. When we were living in Pembroke, my wife loves dogs, and we would have a dog, and there's a whole different culture being a dog owner, and it certainly does connect. And so once again, it's showing that other than human connection, either to animals or to the earth, can have a very profound spiritual experience on us, because I'm sure you would admit that you have opened up to a greater degree since you got that beautiful little puppy.
Mm-hmm. Oh yeah, and also just kind of I mean, I don't have children, so it's kind of my first experience in the sense of like oftentimes just kind of feeling a flow of love, daily, frequently, many times throughout the day, and
Right.
in a way that I wasn't before, and ideally, I guess you would be practicing self-love, but she has really kind of generated those feelings, so it's been really nice.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Jonathan. I think we're just about out of time. I've really enjoyed it, and we could be chatting for a long time. You have certainly brought forth a wonderful perspective on spirituality that I wasn't expecting, and that's what I love about these podcasts. So thank you for that. Why don't you just share a bit of self-promotion about yourself, or anything that you want to add to sum up. I thank you so much for being on the podcast. Share your contact information. It will be in the description of today's podcast with your bio. But do you have anything that you want to just share with the listeners at this time?
Well, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure to chat. It actually has been quite kind of nice and easy. Other than just to say, yeah, I mean, it'll show up in my bio, but I do massage therapy in downtown Toronto, and happy to chat about the body or health or healing anytime. So
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. I highly recommend you reaching out and connect with Jonathan, and maybe if you're looking to dip your toes in the nature pool and understand Mother Earth a little bit more, Jonathan would be a great guy to talk to. Thank you again for being on the podcast. This is the Shaltazar Podcast. My name is Jeffrey Eisen. I'm a spiritual life coach, the channeler of Shaltazar, and an energy intuitive. I love doing these podcasts. I love meeting people and talking about how our spiritual beliefs can help us in our practical life. If you are interested in being a guest on the podcast, please send me an email to jeffrey@jeffreyeisen.com. It's fascinating. I put this invitation out on social media, and I keep connecting with amazing people all over the world. And I would love to have you on the podcast sharing your spiritual beliefs and how we can apply them in a practical way. I am a spiritual life coach, and I invite you to go to my relatively new website, jeffreyeisen.com. If you're interested in chatting with me, if you're interested in the possibility of working with me, you will find a button that says book a discovery session. I encourage you to click on that. It gives you an opportunity to chat with me for 45 minutes to an hour. I get a chance to get a sense of who you are and see if I can in any way help you on your journey. Thank you all for listening. Jonathan, thank you again. Signing off from the Shaltazar Podcast. We'll see you next time. Thanks.